Did you know that ramen actually originates from China? The name was originally used for two other dishes, namely chuka soba and shina soba. Both translate to Chinese noodle. And did you know that an important aspect of ramen restaurants in Japan is that they mostly cater to solo diners and small groups? Konnichiwa, Momo Najmi here, and today I have for you the origin story of ramen. So let's start slurping. Ramen is a Japanese noodle soup. It consists of Chinese wheat noodles served in a meat, fish, or vegetable broth, often flavored with soy sauce or miso, and uses toppings such as sliced pork, nori, which is a dried seaweed, menma made from lacto-fermented bamboo shoots, and scallions or green onions. Nearly every region in Japan has its own variation of ramen. Ramen is widely believed to have originated from China, even though how it made the jump to Japan is still up for debate. The various origin stories place the advent of Japanese ramen anywhere between the 17th century and 20th century. The name was used for two other dishes, namely chuka soba and shina soba. Both translate to Chinese noodle, but with different connotations. And in the earlier days, ramen was referred to as shina soba. Ramen comes from the Chinese word ramyun, which is a wheat based noodle. Japan only co opted the term in the late 19th century when the country was going through an industrial revolution. That's when workers barely had the time to prepare their own meals before leaving for work because they were working so long hours. And so they instead ate in ramen restaurants, which were designed for solo diners and small groups. Eventually, younger and younger customers began to associate ramen more with Japan than its imported origins. Throughout the years, Japan has invented several types of ramen, and the only significant difference is their broths, varying from salt and the type of broth, meaning whether which meat they are of, fish, chicken, a pork, or if whether they are vegetable broth. And also it depends on noodles. However, the noodles are always made with kansui or lye water, which is a mixture of baking soda and water, giving ramen noodles a chewy texture and characteristic yellow color. Today, restaurants in Japan continue their unusual non social design with intimacy and solitary dining in mind, with private booths or partitions between diners to let you enjoy your ramen in peace. It was believed that a scholar named Shu Shunsui brought the recipe of ramen with him when he escaped Manchu rule in China to serve as an advisor to feudal lord Tokugawa Mitsukuni in Japan. While this fit the narrative, with the high cultural influence of China on Japan at the time, there is no historical record of Shunsui actually cooking ramen for Mitsukuni. Now, after the war, a large number of overseas Chinese settled in the three ports of Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki in Japan, thus forming Chinatown and provided a cheap and quickly made choice for the poor working class. It was Chinese workers selling meals from food carts who likely first introduced Japan to the wheat based noodles. So, another theory dates the consumption of Japanese ramen to the founding of Rai Rai Ken in Tokyo by a customs agent who had worked in Yokohama's Chinatown. Opening its door in 1910, the restaurant is known to have employed Chinese cooks and popularized what was then known as Shina Soba. Shina for China and soba for the noodle dish already well established in Japanese cuisine. Shina soba caught on with blue collar workers because it was cheap and filling. But it wasn't just associated with cost cutting, it was also linked to China, a country defeated and conquered during Emperor Meiji's Restoration period. The term ramen was first introduced in Taisho era after Meiji. World War II all but destroyed ramen's first wave of popularity. Because of food shortages and famine, the Japanese government placed tight regulations on food supplies, and earning a profit through restaurants or push carts was strictly prohibited until 1949. However, some wheat flour, which the noodles were made of, found its way into the black market, and many of the unemployed Japanese people turned to hawking ramen, which landed some of them in jail. Now, there are two main events that had a hand in changing the fortunes of ramen. The first was the Meiji Restoration from 1868 to 1912. In the wake of Japan's forced opening to the West by United States Navy's Commodore Perry in 1853, followed by a decade of unequal rights, the young guns who toppled Tokugawa Shogunate before that time and took command wanted to understand Western imperialists better. So they went around the world. And one of the things that caught their attention was how tall the British and Germans were. And they wondered if their dietary habits was the secret behind it. So they made notes of what these people ate. Bread, milk, and meat consumption was noted. So, to improve the fitness of the nation, the Meiji modernizers pushed high protein foods. The campaign to push wheat, meat, and milk was a flop beyond the army conscripts. Still, the movement paved the way for greater acceptance of ramen, as it contained two of these elements, meat and wheat. And furthermore, Chinese soba could be adjusted to fit local taste. Soup noodles were not as alien to Japan as bread or beef roast. Japan already had a long history of noodles, soba, buckwheat noodle, and chewy udon. So cooks eventually began to adapt to Japanese taste. They added fermented miso paste to give the stock an extra umami kick. That second push, however, came a bit later, with the US occupation from 1946 till 1952, and it altered Japanese culture. During the Cold War, the Americans offered assistance to the Japanese in the form of wheat shipments. They tried teaching Japanese women how to make bread in the hopes that the Japanese would ditch the rice. That obviously failed. But Japan was left with surplus wheat. Fortunately, Ando Momofuku had other ideas, and so instant noodles were created. Momofuku Ando was not from Japan. He was an ethnic Chinese born in Japanese controlled Taiwan. His original name was Wu Baifu. At some point, he spent time in prison for tax evasion and struggled to get things going in the tough post war Asia. But he married a Japanese woman and got Japanese citizenship and changed his last name to hers. Ando had a substantial knowledge of food, and as someone who grew up in Taiwan, he was very familiar with pork noodles preparation. He also knew that making ramen noodles was a very time consuming process, so he came up with a method of mass producing and preserving ramen. He learned that you could soften a brick of fried ramen without sacrificing the noodle's springiness by immersing it in hot liquid for few minutes. This trick was actually inspired by tempura, which loses its crunchy texture when in ponzu sauce. And so his corporation Nissin was born. When instant ramen was introduced in 1958, it wasn't budget food for the students and workers. Through the early 70s, it was still aimed at middle class women and children as a nutritious, time saving luxury. In 1971, Nissin introduced cup noodles, or kapu nudoru. Due to its efficiency of using only hot water to cook, the invention became popular throughout the world. Ramen's association with the post war economic boom led to somewhat of a nationalization phase for the dish. Even as vendors gradually went out of business and the generalized Chinese shops that had introduced ramen gave way to newer specialized ramen restaurants, ramen became increasingly identified with Japanese culture, viewed as an alternative to the European cuisine. Ramen was not the brainchild of any single culture or people. It was brought together with the efforts of people from all over across time. From the Portuguese missionaries to the Chinese missionaries to the Japanese imperialists and to the American occupiers. Each of them contributed something to ramen. But through that amalgamation of experiences and influences, ramen became a quintessential Japanese cuisine, an expression of ingenuity and creativity, the pride of Japan, not just a dish, but an entire experience to be had. Now, I want to tell you all about some of the most famous styles of ramen. Shoyu. Shoyu means soya sauce in Japanese, which is exactly what the broth of this ramen is flavored with. It is probably the most commonly found type of ramen. Now, soya sauce might sound like an everyday ingredient, but chefs who serve shoyu ramen don't use ordinary soya sauce. They make their base sauce or tare using a secret blend of ingredients which include dried seafood, dried mushrooms, and herbs, and this tare is often mixed with chicken broth base. Shio. Shio means salt in Japanese. Shio ramen is usually made from chicken broth but can also be made from pork or seafood broth. This ramen is lower in fat and oil and is often clear in appearance, but it is saltier than all the other ramen broths. Miso. Miso ramen is flavored with, yeah, you guessed it, miso. Miso is a traditional Japanese seasoning produced by fermenting soybeans with salt and koji and sometimes rice, barley, seaweed, or other ingredients. It is high in protein and rich in vitamins and minerals. Developed in Hokkaido in the 60s, this broth is considered the youngest of ramen broths. This nutty, sweet soup is entirely Japanese and uses thick, curly, and chewy noodles. Tonkotsu. Born on the island of Kyushu, tonkotsu is the richest of ramens. It is a viscous, creamy ramen made from simmered pork bones. The bones break down and release collagen while cooking, meaning that tonkotsu can be so thick that it coats the back of a spoon. The broth is usually fortified with pork or chicken fat. A subcategory of tonkotsu ramen is Hakata ramen, which also originates from Kyushu. Hakata is very milky white, served with thin, hard noodles and minimal toppings. Now that's because the shop that invented Hakata ramen was just a stand without chairs, and for faster customer service, it made sense to serve quick cooking thin noodles. There are a lot of other ramens that exist. One of the most common type is sokumen, known before as morisoba. Sokumen chefs serve separate bowls of a rich and creamy pork soup alongside chilled, thick and chewy noodles. You're supposed to dip the noodles into the soup and then slurp. Another variation is Chinese-inspired hiyashi chuka. Usually, chefs only serve this brothless ramen during the summer. Although in Sendai region, it is available all year round. It's composed of chilled ramen noodles from various toppings, dressed with a soya or sesame-based sauce. They are also a bura soba, which is served warm, and mazemen, served warm or cold, which are similar types of soupless ramen tossed in an oil based sauce. Apart from the broth, the other key aspect of a ramen is noodles. Some serve thick and chewy, while others thinner, less glutinous noodles. Some even make their noodles in front of the customers, while others make them buy them externally. They are usually made from wheat, flour, salt, egg, and kansui. Some places even allow you to customize the thickness of your noodles and whether you like them a bit firmer or regular. Here are some other interesting facts about ramen. Number 1. According to the World Instant Noodles Association, China consumes the most instant ramen with 46 billion packets a year. Number 2. In Japan, there are at least 22 different recognized styles of ramen, and they are all amazing. Number 3. It was the first type of noodles to be eaten in space. Invented by Momofuku Ando in 2005 for Japanese astronaut Soichi Noguchi's trip in the Discovery Space Shuttle, the Space Ram is a vacuum packed ramen made with smaller noodles and a thicker broth. Number 4. The noodle length inside an instant ramen packet is 51 meters, almost 56 feet. Number 5. Ramen noodles are the best selling items at Rikers Island Jail in New York. Not only that you only need hot water for it, but inmates also use flavor packets inside the ramen to season their other prison food. Okay, that's all I have for you today. You can know more about the history of ramen by reading Barak Kushner's book Slurp, A Social and Culinary History of Ramen, or George Solt's book The Untold History of Ramen, How Political Crisis in Japan Spawned a Global Food Craze, or Eric Rath's book Japan's Cuisines, Food, Place and Identity, among many other sources. But for now, this will have to do. Ramen is my second all time favorite dish. Any and all kinds of ramen. Maybe someday I will tell you about my most all time favorite dish. Next time, I will dig up a bit about the history and creation of radio. So don't forget to tune in. Until then, take care, be good, and thank you so much for listening.